Welcome to another deep dive, and wow, this one is really fascinating. You sent us a ton of stuff about Ernst Cassirer articles, research papers. I even saw some handwritten notes in there. It seems like you're really interested in his whole deal with symbolic forms.
It does seem like that's the through line in all this material, yeah. What strikes me is how much of it focuses on Caster's later work, where he really expands on that idea.
Yeah, I mean, you don't get to be a big deal philosopher without some serious evolution in your thinking, right?
Right. And I think for Casterer, a lot of that evolution happened because of the historical context he was living in the early 20th century. It was a time of huge change, both in science and in society. So to really grasp his ideas, we kind of have to start with that context.
Okay, so back up a bit for someone who maybe hasn't spent their days reading philosophy. Who was this guy?
Well, Ernst Cassirer was a German philosopher born in 1874, died in 1945. And he's known for a lot of things, but he was really influential in the way we think about knowledge, culture, and how humans make sense of the world.
Okay, and from what I've seen in this material, it looks like he was super into the history of ideas, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, he wrote this massive three-volume work called The Problem of Knowledge, where he basically traces how scientific thinking evolved from the Renaissance all the way to Kant.
Wow, 3 volumes. That's commitment.
It is, and it shows how deeply he believed that knowledge is not static. It's not just about accumulating more and more facts. It's about how the whole framework of understanding changes over time.
I'm seeing that theme pop up everywhere in these sources. This idea that knowledge is kind of like an ongoing upgrade process, always building on what came before.
Exactly. He called this the genetic conception of knowledge, and he saw it playing out not just in science, but in all areas of human thought. It's like each new discovery, each new insight doesn't just add to the pile, it actually changes how we see the whole pile.
So give me the example of that. How would this genetic conception play out in, say, physics?
Well, think about Einstein's theory of relativity. It totally revolutionized how we understand space and time, but it didn't completely invalidate Newtonian physics.
Right, right. It's not like we just threw Newton out the window.
Exactly. Instead, relativity sort of absorbed Newtonian physics, showing that those older ideas were still valid, but only within a certain limited framework.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So it's like each new scientific paradigm is like a software update. Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't erase the old code, it builds on it, expands its capabilities.
I like that analogy. And the cool thing is, Cassirer didn't limit this idea to science. He started seeing it everywhere in art, myth, language, all these ways that humans use symbols to make sense of the world.
And that's where his big idea of symbolic forms comes in, right?
Exactly. But to really understand how he got there, we have to talk about this kind of turning point in his intellectual journey, his encounter with the Warburg Library. Have you heard of
Oh
that?
yeah, that's in here somewhere.
Yeah.
It was this massive collection of like the art, mythology, religion, all sorts of cultural stuff.
It was. And for Cassirer, it was a total game changer. He realized that the same dynamic process he saw happening in science, this constant evolution of knowledge through symbols, was also happening in all these other areas of human culture.
So he's seeing that it's not just scientists who are using symbols to understand the world. Artists are doing it, poets, myth makers, everyone's in on the game.
Everyone, yeah.
Okay.
And that's what led him to develop his philosophy of symbolic forms. It was his way of saying, look, science is awesome, but it's not the only way we make sense of things. We have all these other symbolic realms, and they're all equally important for understanding what it means to be human.
Okay, so now I really want to dive into those different symbolic realms.
Yeah.
How did he break them down?
Well, he kind of mapped out this whole taxonomy of symbolic forms, but the basic idea is that there are three main types of symbolic meaning: expressive, representative, and significative.
Okay, and those sound like pretty technical terms. Can you unpack them a little bit? What's going on in each of those realms?
Sure. Let's start with expressive meaning, because that's kind of the foundation for the others. Think about the way you respond to a piece of art, like a painting or a song, that really moves you. It's not just an intellectual thing, right? It's emotional, it's visceral, it hits you on a gut level.
Yeah, it's like you just feel it. You don't even have to think about it.
Right. And that's what expressive meaning is all about. It's that direct, immediate grasp of meaning that's rooted in our emotions and our senses. Cassirer thought that this was the most primal form of symbolic understanding, the one that all the others build on.
Interesting. So it's like the raw material that gets shaped and refined by the other symbolic forms.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's a good way to put it. So, moving on to representative meaning, this is where language starts to come into play. It's how we create a more stable and communicable picture of the world.
Oh, so this is where we go from like just feeling things to actually naming them and categorizing them.
Yes.
Like instead of just experiencing red, we have the word red, and we can talk about it and share that experience with others.
Exactly. And that ability to represent the world through language is huge. It's what allows us to build up complex systems of knowledge and culture.
'Cause what makes us human?
Right.
No other animal can do that to the same extent.
Right. And then building on those first two levels, we get to significative meaning. This is the domain of science, math, logic, all those abstract systems that help us understand the underlying patterns and relationships in the world.
So if expressive meaning is like raw feeling and representative meaning is language, significant meaning is like super refined language. It's taking those basic building blocks and creating these incredibly complex and nuanced models of reality.
I think that's a pretty good way to think about it. Cassirer saw science as this incredibly powerful tool for understanding the world, but he was also very careful to point out that it wasn't the only tool, and it definitely wasn't the only kind of truth.
That seems like a really important distinction, especially in our culture, where science sometimes gets put on this pedestal, like it's the only valid way of knowing anything. But Cassirer is saying, hold on, there are other ways of knowing, and they're just as important.
Yeah, I mean, think about art. It might not give us the same kind of knowledge as a scientific experiment, but it can tell us things about the human experience, about beauty and emotion that science can't really touch.
Right, right. And this is where Cassirer's ideas start to get really interesting, I think, especially when you compare him to someone like Hegel.
Ah, yes, Hegel, the granddaddy of German idealism. Cassirer was definitely influenced by him, but he also had some pretty major disagreements with Hegel's system.
Okay, spill the tea. What were they fighting about?
Well, one big difference was how they viewed history. Hegel had this very teleological view of history, meaning he saw it as moving towards a specific endpoint, the realization of the absolute idea. It's like everything is unfolding according to this grand plan, and humanity is on this inevitable march towards some ultimate truth.
So it's like a play where the ending is already written, we're just acting it out.
Exactly. But Cassirer, living through the craziness of the 20th century with two world wars and the rise of fascism, he just couldn't buy that whole predetermined destiny thing.
Makes sense? After all that chaos, it's hard to believe that history is marching towards some perfect endpoint.
Right. Cassirer saw history as much more contingent, much more open-ended. He emphasized human agency, the fact that we have choices, we can make decisions that shape the course of events. It's not all just playing out according to some cosmic script.
So for Cassirer, history is more like an improv show. We don't know what's going to happen next, but we're all making it up as we go along.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. And that difference in how they viewed history really shaped how they thought about culture. For Hegel, culture was ultimately a vehicle for this unfolding of the absolute idea. It was a means to an end.
But for Cassirer, culture was the main event. It wasn't about reaching some predetermined goal. It was about the process of creating meaning through these different symbolic forms.
Precisely. And that's what makes Casserer's work so relevant, I think, especially in today's world. He reminds us that we are constantly creating and recreating culture through the ways we use symbols.
And that those symbols have power, right?
Ah,
They can be used for good, but they can also be manipulated and twisted to do some pretty messed up things.
absolutely. And that brings us to what might be his most important and definitely his most chilling work, the myth of the state.
So the myth of the state, this was like his warning flare, right? He was seeing how these symbolic forms, these things we use to understand the world, could actually be turned against us.
Yeah, it's a really powerful book, and it's definitely a warning. Remember, he was writing this in the 1930s with the rise of Nazism happening all around him. And he saw firsthand how myth and propaganda could be used to create this kind of collective frenzy, this mass delusion that swept away reason and critical thinking.
And it wasn't just happening in Germany, right? There were these authoritarian movements popping up all over Europe, all using the same kind of playbook, tapping into people's fears, creating scapegoats, promising easy solutions to complex problems.
Exactly. And Cassirer was really trying to understand how this was happening, how entire societies could be seduced by these dangerous ideologies.
So what was his diagnosis? What was it about these mythical narratives that made them so effective?
Well, he argued that myth operates on this different level than reason. It appeals to our emotions, to our instincts, to those deep-seated desires and fears that we don't always fully understand.
It's like it bypasses our rational mind and goes straight for the gut.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because once you tap into that emotional level, it's really hard to counter with logic or evidence.
It's like trying to argue with someone who's in a trance.
Yeah, kind of. And Cassirer was really worried about how modern technology was making this problem even worse. He saw that radio and mass media were already creating these echo chambers where people were only exposed to information that confirmed their existing beliefs.
It's crazy how much he was anticipating the internet and social media, where misinformation spreads like wildfire.
Right. And he even talks about how this kind of mass communication can create a situation where the distinction between truth and falsehood becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is whether a story resonates emotionally, whether it confirms your biases, whether it makes you feel like you belong to a group.
So it's not just about ignorance or lack of education. It's something much deeper, something about the human psyche itself that makes us vulnerable to these kinds of narratives.
Yeah, and I think that's why The Myth of the State is such an important book for us to read today. Because it's not just about the past, it's about understanding those vulnerabilities in ourselves, those things that make us susceptible to manipulation, even when we think we're being rational.
So if we're all kind of wired for myth, how do we protect ourselves? What's the antidote to this kind of thinking?
Well, Cassirer believed the best defense is critical thinking. It's about being skeptical, questioning assumptions, demanding evidence, seeking out diverse perspectives. It's about being willing to change our minds when presented with new information.
But that's so hard, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides. How do we even know where to start?
I know, it's overwhelming. But I think one of the most important things we can do is to be aware of our own biases, to recognize that we all have these preconceived notions about the world, and that those biases can shape how we interpret information.
So it's like step one is being honest with ourselves about what we already believe and why we believe it.
Right. And once we're aware of our biases, we can start to challenge them. We can ask ourselves, why do I believe this? What evidence supports this belief? What are the counter arguments? And maybe most importantly, am I willing to change my mind if I'm presented with evidence that contradicts my beliefs?
That last one is tough. Nobody likes to admit they're wrong.
I know, it's not easy. But I think that's really the key to critical thinking, this willingness to be wrong, to have your mind changed, because that's how we learn and grow.
It's like that saying, a mind stretched by a new idea never returns to its original dimensions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Katzer would say that's what education is all about, stretching our minds, exposing ourselves to new ideas, learning how to think for ourselves.
So it's not just about stuffing our heads full of facts. It's about developing those critical thinking skills, learning how to navigate this complex world of information and symbols.
Right. And I think Kasser would say that that's not just important for individuals, it's crucial for the health of a democracy. Because when people can think critically, when they can see through propaganda and manipulation, they're much less likely to fall prey to those dangerous ideologies that he was writing about.
It's like he's giving us this toolkit for building a more resilient society, a
Ugh.
society that's less susceptible to those kinds of mass delusions.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. He was giving us a way to fight back against those forces that try to control us through myth and fear.
It's been a really fascinating deep dive, and I have to say, I'm feeling a little more hopeful after talking about all this. Like, yeah, the world is a mess, and there are all these forces trying to manipulate us, but we're not powerless. We have the ability to think for ourselves, to question, to challenge, to create a better future.
That's exactly the message I hope people take away from Casserer's work. That we have a responsibility to use those critical thinking skills, not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of everyone.
So to our listener, we hope this deep dive is giving you a lot to think about. We've only scratched the surface of Cassirer's work, but hopefully it sparked your curiosity and maybe even inspired you to do some more exploring on your own.
And remember, like Casserer himself said, the fate of human culture depends on our ability to defend reason against its enemies. So go out there, be critical, be curious, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.